The echoes of Peril Strait. My name is Sarah Jenkins. I was 32 at the time, and I worked as a marine biologist with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. For most of my career, I had been entrenched in data-driven studies, focusing on benthic ecosystems and coral reef development in controlled field environments. My days were methodical, analyzing sediment samples, charting currents, and logging marine species sightings. Life was a combination of quiet research trips and long nights compiling data in sterile labs. I thrived on routine. My colleagues often joked that my concept of adventure was watching a plankton bloom under a microscope, but I was content. Science was predictable, controlled, and measurable. That changed in the spring of 2017, when I received a special assignment, a 6-month survey of a previously undocumented deep-sea coral reef system near Peril Strait in southeast Alaska. The location was remote to the point of being almost mythical among ANOAA personnel. Charts indicated a narrow waterway hemmed in by jagged cliffs, ice-laden currents, and treacherous tidal shifts. The strait had a notorious reputation among local fishermen. Stories of vessels disappearing without trace, compasses failing, and sudden storms appearing out of nowhere. To me, these were the kind of legends you expect from mariners trying to rationalize natural hazards. The assignment itself was presented formally, almost clinically, as a survey of benthic biodiversity, a mapping of the reef structures, and a preliminary study for potential environmental monitoring. The nearest settlement was Port Argo, a fishing village of roughly 50 residents. The town clung precariously to a rocky outcrop above the strait, its wooden docks pockmarked by decades of storms. When I arrived, the air smelled of salt and decay, a briny scent layered with damp wood. Villagers were cordial but distant, their eyes wary, sizing me up as though assessing whether I belonged or could be trusted. When I inquired about the history of the strait, about previous research or incidents, I was met with vague warnings. "The pull is strong," one elderly fisherman said, his gaze drifting over the dark waters. "You don't want to linger too long near the deep." Others shrugged, dismissing their own words when I pressed, as if afraid of being overheard. I established my base in a small cabin maintained by NO, insulated as best as possible against the unrelenting cold. My equipment was extensive: a research sub capable of descending beyond 2,500 meters, sonar arrays, remotely operated vehicles, and high-resolution cameras for mapping reef structures. The first few dives were routine. I mapped coral formations, cataloged sponge and mollusk populations, and recorded topographical anomalies. Initially, my results were unremarkable. Though visually stunning, nothing defied known marine science. The first anomaly appeared during a routine sonar scan. The array registered massive, elongated shapes moving beneath the seafloor. At first, I assumed equipment malfunction. The readings were irregular, sometimes vanishing entirely, sometimes returning with abrupt shifts. But these signals were enormous, far too large to be any known creature. Over the next few weeks, I observed a repeating pattern. The objects appeared near the deepest crevices, moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, and seemed almost aware of our equipment. Multiple divers confirmed similar readings with separate instruments. Even the autonomous ROV cameras intermittently failed when approaching the coordinates, cutting out for minutes at a time with no discernible cause. Local legends began to take on a strange resonance. Port Argo residents spoke of the Deep Ones, beings of immense size that dragged small boats into the water or created currents capable of stranding experienced mariners. One retired fisherman gave me an old notebook, tattered and water-stained, filled with entries about lost crews. sightings of giant shapes beneath the surface, and unexplainable tidal surges. Each entry ended abruptly, sometimes midword, suggesting the writer's disappearance or interruption. I digitized the pages carefully. My heart rate increased each time I read the fragmented notes aloud. By the end of the first month, I began experiencing unusual malfunctions in my instrumentation. Sonar pulses would occasionally return with geometric interference patterns, impossible for organic matter to produce. Depth gauges oscillated wildly, and ROV cameras would intermittently freeze on frames showing shapes that didn't correspond to any known marine topology. I documented everything meticulously, creating redundant backups in multiple formats. My professional skepticism began to waver. These readings were consistent, reproducible, and increasingly alarming. During a scheduled deep dive, I experienced the first tangible sense of danger. At 200 meters depth, I noticed a sudden, violent pull on the sub. My instruments indicated no geological activity. The current was inexplicably strong, as if the vessel itself had been seized by an unseen hand. Panicked, I attempted to correct course, but the thrusters responded sluggishly, delayed by a fraction of a second, long enough for the vessel to tilt dangerously. It was then that I saw it, or rather, its presence. Beyond the sub's floodlights, an immense form shimmered, geometric and indescribably vast. Tendrils of energy or bioluminescence radiated outward, pulsating with a rhythm that my instruments could not fully capture. The hull vibrated in resonance with the entity's motion, and every sonar pulse I sent out returned distorted echoes. I was trapped, unable to ascertain whether the creature was corporeal or some natural anomaly magnified by environmental conditions. My sub's emergency ascent systems engaged automatically, probably as a precaution triggered by pressure and tilt sensors. I fought the controls manually, battling against the unseen force, and managed to break free, returning to the surface, gasping for air. The Coast Guard, alerted by my automated distress beacon, arrived within the hour, finding me pale, trembling, and babbling about geometric shapes beneath the ocean floor. My readings, though intermittent, corroborated my account. Multiple instruments recorded massive anomalies at precise coordinates. Back on shore, NOAA convened an emergency review. I presented raw sonar logs, depth profiles, video feeds, and photographic evidence. The official statement classified the strait as an environmental hazard zone due to unstable seafloor activity and magnetic interference. Press releases mentioned geological instability and the risk of underwater landslides, but made no reference to anomalous entities. Port Argo was evacuated, officially because of deteriorating infrastructure, but I knew there were deeper, unspoken reasons. My hard drives and notebooks were retained for further review, and I was ordered to refrain from public comment. Subsequent months were marked by bureaucratic obfuscation. Internal emails hinted at previous, undisclosed studies in the area. References to missing vessels and top-secret sonar tests suggested that my encounter was not isolated, that the anomaly, or entity, had been monitored intermittently for decades. Requests for follow-up dives were denied. Surveillance of the strait increased, with Coast Guard patrols positioned irregularly, yet no explanation was given. I became aware that my personal and professional reputation could be jeopardized if I spoke too freely. Even after leaving Alaska, the experience followed me. Nightmares of impossible geometries and pulsating forms haunted my sleep. I occasionally received cryptic messages from former colleagues, hinting that the strait remained active and that further exploration was prohibited. The data I had collected remained classified, inaccessible, and partially redacted. I continued to hear the low-frequency hum in my mind, the memory of tendrils extending into the abyss, the weight of something ancient observing silently. The peril strait remains uncharted. A forbidden corridor in the Pacific Northwest waters. No-way maps mark only hazards, not anomalies. Local fishermen refuse to return, citing tales of the pull and vanished boats. And I know, without doubt, that the strait harbors something beyond our understanding, a presence that the world has chosen to ignore. I will never forget the hum, the pulse, and the eyes, or whatever it was, that watched me from the abyss. Some things are better left alone, buried in the cold, dark waters, waiting. The Whispering Pines of Chena. I was 47 years old when I went to Chena, long past my formal career with the National Park Service, and settled into what I considered a quieter, more honest line of work. I described myself as an amateur folklorist, but the term was misleading. I wasn't chasing legends for entertainment. I was cataloging the points where stories intersected with administrative silence. My days followed a routine I trusted. I woke early, usually before sunrise, and spent the first hours reviewing archival material. Incident logs, land use surveys, handwritten ranger journals that never made it into digital systems. I kept meticulous notes, cross-referencing dates, names, and locations. In the afternoons, I conducted interviews, mostly with elderly residents who remembered places as they were before federal oversight standardized the narrative. Evenings were reserved for transcription and data backup. I lived quietly, deliberately, with no interest in dramatization. I had spent decades as a park ranger. I understood how landscapes were managed, how incidents were documented, and, more importantly, how inconvenient events were quietly reclassified, deferred, or allowed to fade into statistical noise. Patterns mattered more than individual accounts. One story meant nothing. 10 similar stories across decades meant something had been contained rather than solved. Chena entered my research because of a pattern that refused to resolve. While reviewing Alaska State Trooper missing persons summaries from the mid-20th century onward, I noticed a cluster northeast of Fairbanks, centered loosely around Chena Hot Springs and the surrounding forest. The reports were sparse, often no more than a paragraph. Vehicles recovered. No remains. Exposure listed as probable cause despite contradictory evidence. In several cases, the missing were experienced outdoorsmen, hunters, surveyors, rangers, people unlikely to make basic survival errors in familiar terrain. What struck me was not the disappearances themselves, but how uniformly the investigations ended. The same phrasing appeared repeatedly: search suspended, terrain instability, no further action recommended. Different decades, different officers, same language. The trigger came when a former colleague, someone I had served with years earlier, mailed me a photocopy without explanation. It was a single page from a handwritten ranger incident log dated 1968. The ink had faded, but the entry was legible. Search initiated 0740 hours. Subject last seen near Whispering Pines sector. Audible disorientation reported by search team. Operation terminated 1910 hours. Subject not recovered. Area assessment deferred per directive. There was no directive number, no signature. Just initials I recognized. Someone who had later moved into a regional administrative role. I had heard the term Whispering Pines before. Always in passing, always without detail. Locals spoke it quietly, as if naming it too directly might draw attention. The log entry confirmed it wasn't just folklore. It was operational language. I decided to go. I planned the trip carefully, notifying my wife of my route and schedule, filing travel details with a friend in Fairbanks, and packing redundancies for navigation and communication. I drove north in late summer, when the days were long, but the weather could still turn without warning. The highway narrowed as I approached the interior. Cell service dropped out in stages, then vanished entirely. The isolation of the area wasn't dramatic, it was procedural. Roads became less maintained. Signage thinned. The forest pressed closer to the pavement. Tall pines forming dense corridors that limited visibility. Sound behaved differently there, dampened, as if absorbed by the landscape rather than reflected. Chena Hot Springs itself was modest, catering to tourists who rarely ventured beyond designated paths. I stayed in a small cabin nearby, unremarkable except for its distance from anything resembling infrastructure. The nearest town with consistent services was hours away under ideal conditions. I began by speaking with locals. Most were polite but evasive. When I asked about the Whispering Pines, conversation shortened. One older man, who had worked seasonal maintenance decades earlier, told me flatly that people didn't get lost there. "They get misplaced," he said. I asked what he meant. He shook his head and walked away. My first walks along the perimeter of the pines were deliberately cautious. I didn't enter immediately. I observed. I logged ambient conditions. On the second afternoon, I noticed my GPS registering inconsistent distances. Short walks recorded as nearly double their actual length. My compass needle drifted several degrees off north, then corrected itself abruptly, without the gradual settling typical of magnetic interference. That night, reviewing my notes inside the cabin, I became aware of an absence. No insects, no wind through the trees. The forest outside had gone silent. It wasn't sudden. It was as if the sound had been gradually removed. I checked the time. The silence lasted just under 20 minutes before normal ambient noise returned. I documented it and moved on. Pattern recognition came slowly, through accumulation. In an abandoned general store near the outskirts of the area, I found old missing persons flyers taped behind a counter. Some dated to the 1970s, others earlier. Many were handwritten. Nearly all referenced the same region. Names repeated across different decades, not victims but officials involved in searches. In Fairbanks, I spent 2 days in the regional archives. Forestry Service maps from the 1940s through the 1980s showed something unusual. Entire sections of the Whispering Pines were left blank or overwritten with generic warnings. Unstable terrain, survey incomplete. One margin note, initialed but unsigned, read, "Instrument failure persistent. Area excluded." There was no follow-up documentation. The first hard evidence came from an inventory list tied to a ranger who vanished in 1967. His personal effects had been cataloged after his disappearance. Among them was a cassette tape recovered from his cabin, never logged as evidence and never transcribed. A retired clerk, sympathetic to my work, helped me locate it. The tape was degraded but playable. It contained fragmented audio, breathing, disoriented speech, references to time slipping, and a low-frequency hum that didn't resemble mechanical noise or wind. The ranger mentioned landmarks that no longer existed, then stopped speaking abruptly. The recording ended not with static, but with silence that felt intentional. When I notified the local ranger office of my findings, their tone changed. I was advised not to enter the Whispering Pines due to safety concerns. No written order was provided. A supervisor referenced a standing advisory that did not appear in public records. When I asked for documentation, the conversation ended. Over the next 2 days, I noticed subtle changes. My vehicle was photographed while parked near trail access. A state official visited my cabin unannounced, asked about my research focus, and suggested I submit my materials for review. He framed it as a courtesy, but emphasized liability and public misunderstanding. Institutional resistance didn't arrive as force. It arrived as pressure. I entered the Whispering Pines on the fourth day. The transition was immediate. Sound dampened within minutes of crossing the tree line. No birds, no insects. Even my footsteps felt muted. My GPS flickered, then shut down entirely. My compass began spinning without settling. This was the silent dread moment. Not fear, but awareness. The sense of being observed without any identifiable source. The forest layout felt inconsistent. Paths looped back on themselves. Familiar landmarks appeared twice, then vanished. Time behaved strangely. Light shifted too quickly. The sun's position jumped rather than moved. I began to feel physically disoriented, not dizzy, but unmoored. Movement appeared at the edge of my vision. Not figures in the traditional sense, more like absences shaped roughly like people. They never entered my direct line of sight. When I turned, there was nothing. Then I heard the hum from the cassette tape. It wasn't loud, it resonated physically, vibrating through my chest and jaw. It created vertigo, slowed my thoughts, made direction feel arbitrary. Panic set in only when I realized my internal sense of time no longer matched physical exertion. I ran without strategy. When I emerged onto the main road, I collapsed. According to my watch, fewer than 10 minutes had passed. My body told a different story. Dehydration, muscle fatigue. Confusion consistent with prolonged exertion. Authorities arrived after my wife reported me overdue. My vehicle was found at the original trailhead, coated in dust consistent with several days of inactivity. The official report attributed my condition to heat stress and confusion. My statements regarding time loss, environmental anomalies, and audio phenomena were excluded. The institutional response followed quickly. The Whispering Pines area was reclassified as restricted due to environmental hazards. Access points were quietly blocked. No press release was issued. When I requested copies of my own incident report, sections were redacted. In the aftermath, I attempted to correlate other cases. Several individuals who had emerged from the pines alive showed similar symptoms. Memory gaps, inconsistent aging markers, unexplained physiological stress. None received follow-up evaluations. No arrests were made, no formal investigation acknowledged. The ranger logs remain partially classified. The maps are still incomplete. I never returned. But sometimes, on still nights, I feel that same low pressure, the echo of a hum that doesn't belong to sound. The forest remains. The blank spaces on the maps remain. And whatever disrupts orientation and time there continues without explanation, unchallenged by the institutions tasked with understanding it. The Whispering Pines are quiet because something inside them is still operating, and it has never been shut down. The Crimson Tide of Kodiak. I was 55 years old in the summer of 2017, and I'd spent nearly every one of my adult years working the waters around Kodiak Island. Fishing wasn't just a job there, it was infrastructure. It was history. It was how the town functioned. When something shifted offshore, it showed up everywhere else within days. At the docks, in the cannery schedules, in the way people talked at the supply stores. My life followed a pattern I trusted. Wake before sunrise. Check the weather band. Walk the dock. Checking lines and fuel. Start the engines while the harbor was still half asleep. Kodiak mornings were quiet in a specific way, not empty, but contained. You could hear if something didn't belong. That summer began like any other. The quotas were stable. The grounds were familiar. My crew had been with me for years. We didn't take risks we didn't understand. The first warning wasn't dramatic, it was accounting. Our catches were smaller. Not catastrophic, just off enough to notice. Same nets, same locations, same timing. The fish that came up looked wrong. Lesions around the gills, discoloration along the belly. We logged it. So did other captains. Everyone assumed a temporary imbalance. Warm currents, migration shift. Then the water itself started to look wrong. In certain inlets, places you only entered deliberately, I noticed a thin film on the surface. Not everywhere, not constant, just enough to break the reflection. When the sun hit it at the right angle, it shimmered with a faint rainbow sheen. That's when I started paying attention. The trigger came from shore. A fisherman I'd known since the 90s called me late one night. He asked if my crew had complained about the water, said his well tasted metallic, said it burned his throat. His property backed up against land bordering the old Kodiak Naval Operating Base. That base had been decommissioned long before. Officially cleaned, officially sealed. Most of us didn't think about it. You learned to live around leftovers up there, but then the clinic started getting busy. Respiratory issues, skin irritation, a few neurological symptoms that didn't line up with anything common. The official explanation was vague. Environmental stressors, seasonal factors, nothing actionable. The arrival point, for me, wasn't physical, it was administrative. I started mapping reports, where the fish were sick, where the water tasted wrong, where people were getting ill. The overlap wasn't subtle. Everything clustered around the same stretches of shoreline near the old base. That was when I went to the city clerk's office. Kodiak keeps records the way small towns do. Boxes, shelves, rooms. No one audits unless there's a reason. I requested historical harbor permits under the excuse of insurance documentation. While waiting, I noticed a sealed archival box with a faded federal inventory stamp. Inside were copies of EPA correspondence from the late 1990s. Environmental sampling reports. Soil, water, sediment. The results were explicit. Elevated heavy metals, chemical compounds that didn't match any declared materials on record. The recommendations were equally explicit: immediate remediation, restricted access, long-term monitoring. None of it had been followed. Those documents were the first hard evidence. I photographed every page. When I brought copies to a local official I trusted, he didn't deny them. He didn't even argue. He told me, quietly, that the issue had been resolved above the local level. He wouldn't say who made that determination. He advised me to stop asking. That was the first time I understood the resistance wasn't ignorance. It was instruction. Things escalated quickly after that. By early August, the cannery slowed to a crawl. Boats started avoiding certain inlets without saying why. At night, people reported lights offshore. Stationary, low to the water, not matching any registered vessels. The Coast Guard logged inquiries. No official responses were issued. Then the salmon died. Thousands of them surfaced in St. Paul Harbor over the course of a single night. The water turned dark, almost red, clogged with bodies. The smell was overwhelming. It shut the harbor down immediately. My vessel, the Sea Serpent, was assigned to assist with containment. It was routine work on paper, booms, collection, towing debris away from active channels. As we approached the harbor hedge near the old base, a vessel intercepted us, unmarked, armed personnel on deck. They ordered us to turn back, claiming restricted operations. They didn't identify themselves. I requested clarification over radio, no response. I kept moving. Through binoculars, I saw activity on a decaying pier inside the restricted zone. Men in protective suits were rolling large, unmarked barrels toward the edge, dumping them directly into the water already saturated with dead fish. The air above the surface wavered, carrying a sharp chemical smell that burned the back of the throat. I raised my phone. A rifle shot shattered the cabin window inches from my head. There was no warning, no escalation, just immediate lethal force. I turned hard and pushed the engines beyond their comfort zone. Shots followed us until we cleared the perimeter. That was the confrontation. No room for misunderstanding. I called the Coast Guard immediately. They arrived fast. Took statements, documented damage. By the time they reached the pier, it was empty. No barrels, no personnel, no vessels. The official report later cited unconfirmed reports of illegal disposal and no conclusive evidence. My photographs were deemed insufficient. The documents I provided were labeled outdated. The incident was closed. That was the institutional response. Over the following months, the illnesses continued, quietly. Death certificates cited environmental causes. Unknown pathogens. No public investigation was announced. The old base remained guarded, now openly, by private security contractors whose authority no one could clearly explain. No cleanup occurred. No accountability followed. The evidence cache I gathered, documents, photographs, logs, went nowhere. Federal agencies declined jurisdiction. State offices deferred. Local leadership avoided the subject entirely. Kodiak returned to routine on the surface. Fishing resumed. The water cleared in places, but certain inlets stayed empty. Boats avoided them without discussion. The threat never resolved. It settled. I still fish these waters. I don't have another trade. But every time the tide shifts a color at sunset, I remember that contamination doesn't disappear. It waits, and whatever was buried beneath Kodiak's shoreline was never meant to be seen. The Raven's Cry of Hyder. My name is Evelyn Reed. I was 28 years old when I arrived in Hyder, Alaska, and at the time I believed I understood isolation. My academic work had taken me to small communities before. Villages reachable only by boat, towns with single airstrips and unreliable power. But those places were still connected by some expectation of oversight. Someone knew they were there. Someone checked in. Hyder was different. Hyder felt unobserved. Before this assignment, my life was orderly and procedural. I lived in shared graduate housing, worked part-time cataloging archival materials, and spent most of my days transcribing interviews or annotating field notes. My research focus was narrow: how ritual persists in communities that experience prolonged geographic and cultural isolation. I approached it as documentation, not belief. I didn't participate. I recorded. Hyder entered my awareness through footnotes. It appeared sporadically in ethnographic surveys of southeastern Alaska and northern British Columbia, usually as a linguistic aside or a historical anomaly. A town technically within U.S. borders but accessible only through Canada. A population that fluctuated but never truly vanished. One phrase recurred across multiple sources, always unattributed, always unexplained, the Raven's Cry. The trigger for my visit was a small research grant approved with unusual speed. There were no objections, no caveats. I was authorized to conduct interviews, review historical records, and remain in town for up to 6 weeks. No one warned me about timing. No one mentioned restrictions. Hyder sits at the end of the road, literally. You drive through Stewart, British Columbia, cross an unguarded border, and the pavement simply stops. The town presses up against the Misty Fjords National Monument, surrounded by dense, ancient forest that absorbs sound and limits sight lines. Mountains rise abruptly. Fog rolls in without warning. There is no redundancy. If something goes wrong, help is far away and delayed. When I arrived, the population hovered somewhere under 100. Buildings leaned from age and moisture. Many were occupied only seasonally. The welcome sign proclaimed Hyder the friendliest ghost town in Alaska. I took photographs. I wrote it down as local humor. My first week passed without incident. I conducted interviews during daylight hours, mostly in kitchens and on porches. People were polite but guarded. They answered questions about logging history, border traffic, bear encounters. When I asked about traditional practices, responses became shorter. Several interviewees referenced something called the silent season. No one defined it. The early irregularities were subtle enough that I initially dismissed them as social discomfort. A store clerk asked when I planned to leave, then corrected herself and said, "Most visitors don't stay long." A local council member advised me to focus on documented history, not oral accounts. A fisherman laughed when I asked about the raven's cry and told me, "That's not for outsiders." The pattern emerged slowly. Every mention of the silent season came with an implied deadline. Phrases like, "before it starts," or "if you're still here then," appeared in conversation. When I pressed for dates, people deflected. One man told me, "The forest sets the calendar." The first tangible evidence came from the Hyder Historical Society. The building was small, unlocked, and rarely staffed. Inside, I found shelves of handwritten journals kept by various custodians over more than a century. The records were meticulous. Dates, weather conditions, population counts. Tucked among them were ledgers labeled simply observances. The entries followed a 7-year cycle. Each cycle began with references to preparation, food stores, livestock tallies. Then came entries marked the offering or the exchange. Language varied, but intent did not. Some entries referenced animals, others did not specify. A recurring term appeared, the tithe. What unsettled me was the consistency. Different authors, different eras, the same structure. Names appeared in margins, sometimes crossed out. Sometimes followed by a single word, accepted. I attempted to cross-reference these names with public records. Census data showed population dips at corresponding intervals. Marriage records stopped abruptly for certain families. Death certificates were absent. Police records, where they should have existed, were missing entirely. When I requested official documentation through state channels, I encountered immediate resistance. I was told records from Hyder were incomplete due to jurisdictional ambiguity. Another official suggested the losses were due to migration. No one addressed the cyclical timing. As my research deepened, the atmosphere in town changed. People became withdrawn. Doors closed earlier. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Notices appeared on community boards about temporary closures without explanation. One evening, while reviewing scanned journal pages in my rented room, I noticed the town had gone silent. Not quiet, absent. No generators, no radios, no wind. Even the distant waters seemed muted. It lasted long enough for me to become aware of my own breathing and the sound of the page turning. The silence ended abruptly, all at once, like a switch being thrown. The escalation into personal danger began when I realized my timing was not accidental. According to the journals, the silent season began within days. Roads were not blocked, but traffic ceased. No boats moved on the water, no visitors arrived, no one left. The critical moment came late one night when I saw movement outside my window. figures, moving in a line, carrying a large, canvas-wrapped form toward the forest edge. They wore plain clothing, no insignia, no urgency. I documented the time, direction, and duration. I did not intervene. The next evening, Mrs. Albright knocked on my door. She was one of the few residents who had been consistently kind to me. She was shaking. She told me I had been seen watching, that I had broken the pact. She said the raven's cry had been called. She pressed a carved raven into my hands. It was old, the eyes were hollowed out completely. She told me it was already counted. Then she left. The following morning, her house was empty. No furniture, no personal effects. When I asked about her, I was told she had never lived there. Her name did not appear in recent records. At that point, I stopped treating this as research. I began planning to leave. That night, I packed only essentials. Using an old logging trail Mrs. Albright had mentioned weeks earlier, I left town under cover of darkness. The forest closed in quickly. Sound behaved strangely. Ravens called, but not in recognizable patterns. The calls echoed in ways that made distance impossible to judge. I heard movement behind me, multiple footsteps. I did not look back. I reached the Canadian highway just before dawn and flagged down a passing vehicle. The driver took me to the nearest RCMP station. I gave a formal statement. I provided copies of my notes, photographs, and scanned journal pages. The institutional response was controlled and minimal. Officers contacted Alaskan authorities. An inquiry was logged. The conclusion was that Hyder was operating within its rights as a remote community. No evidence of criminal activity was found. No missing persons reports were active. The case was closed quietly. Some of my files were requested later by agencies that did not identify themselves. Others were returned with sections redacted. Requests for clarification went unanswered. I no longer conduct field research. Hyder still exists. Every 7 years, access diminishes without official notice. There are no advisories, no warnings, and no one seems able to explain why. The Glacial Heart of Denali. I am Dr. Eris Thorne. At the time of this incident, I was 42 years old and employed as a glaciologist with the University of Alaska, Anchorage. My specialization was subglacial dynamics, the slow movement of ice over bedrock, meltwater behavior, and long-term stability modeling. I had been working in Alaska for nearly 2 decades. Nothing in my prior field experience suggested that ice could behave in any way other than mechanically and predictably. My daily life before the expedition was unremarkable. I taught 2 courses each semester, supervised graduate research, and spent evenings processing satellite data or calibrating instruments. I lived alone in a small house north of Anchorage. I avoided unnecessary travel. I did not pursue speculative research. My professional reputation was built on conservative conclusions and repeatable results. The Ruth Glacier Project originated from a federal climate monitoring grant. The stated objective was simple: update subglacial topography maps to improve melt rate projections for Denali National Park. The Ruth Glacier was selected because of its size, depth, and relative isolation from tourist routes. It was considered geologically stable. There was no prior indication of unusual conditions. The permit process was unusually fast. The National Park Service approved our access within weeks. There were no exclusions, no protected subzones, and no restrictions beyond standard safety guidelines. At the time, I considered this efficiency a positive sign. In retrospect, it stands out. We deployed in late summer when conditions were optimal. Our team consisted of 5 people: myself, two doctoral candidates specializing in remote sensing, a radar systems technician contracted through the university, and a logistics lead with extensive Denali experience. All had prior glacier fieldwork backgrounds. None had a reputation for panic or exaggeration. Access required a ski-equipped bush plane. Once airborne, radio communication degraded rapidly. The glacier sits deep within a basin surrounded by high ridges that block signal transmission. When we landed, the sense of isolation was immediate and complete. There were no aircraft paths overhead, no distant engine noise, no human markers of any kind, only ice, rock, and wind. We established camp near the glacier's edge and began instrument deployment the same day. The ground-penetrating radar system was standard issue, calibrated before departure, and cross-checked on known terrain. The first anomaly appeared within the initial survey pass. The radar returns showed flat, sharply defined surfaces beneath the ice. At first, I assumed bedrock layering or an equipment artifact. We recalibrated and ran the same transect again. The reflections remained unchanged. When we expanded the grid, additional shapes appeared. They were not random. They repeated at consistent intervals, aligned along a central axis beneath the glacier. Rectangular volumes, angular junctions. The geometry was incompatible with natural rock formations. Ice deformation typically obscures sharp boundaries over time. These shapes were clean. The radar technician verified the data independently. No malfunction was identified. The doctoral candidates began mapping the returns manually, assuming a data visualization error. The shapes persisted across frequencies and depths. The first human warning came from my logistics lead. On the second day, he complained of headaches and nausea. He attributed it to altitude and dehydration. By the third day, he described a persistent sensation of pressure underfoot, like standing above heavy machinery. He asked me, without humor, whether anything was operating beneath the ice. At night, the glacier behaved differently than expected. Typically, ice produces thermal sounds as temperatures shift. Here, there was an absence of sound, no cracking, no settling. The silence felt unnatural, but at the time I could not quantify why. On the fourth night, I woke suddenly with chest pressure and vertigo. The sensation passed after several minutes. I did not report it. As the survey continued, our gravimetric sensors began registering rhythmic fluctuations, small consistent variations in mass beneath the ice, repeating at regular intervals. This was not consistent with seismic activity or meltwater movement. The frequency did not match known glacial oscillations. We attempted to correlate the pulses with environmental data. There was no corresponding temperature shift, no surface movement, no atmospheric change. The glacier appeared externally stable. During a perimeter reconnaissance, one of the doctoral candidates discovered an old structure partially buried under snow and moraine. It was a trapper's cabin, likely abandoned decades earlier. Inside, we found paper materials preserved by cold and dryness. The journals belonged to a geological survey team operating in the early 1930s. The names did not appear in modern records. The entries described early seismic mapping attempts in the same region of the glacier. Several sketches showed subsurface shapes that closely resembled our radar data. The language used was unscientific but consistent. Repeated references to the Great Pulse, mentions of drilling causing responses, warnings against disturbance. The final entry contained a single line written with heavy pressure. It is waking. I logged the find according to protocol and notified our National Park Service liaison. The response took over 24 hours. When it arrived, it was non-committal. We were instructed to document but not remove the materials. 2 days later, a federal official arrived by helicopter without prior notice. He identified himself only as representing interagency interests. He confiscated the journals and maps. No receipt was provided. No explanation was offered. Shortly after, our permit was amended. Maximum drilling depth was reduced without justification. We were instructed to avoid subsurface disturbance. Communications from the university became cautious. I was advised, informally, to avoid speculative interpretations in field notes. Despite this, the anomalies intensified. The gravimetric pulses grew stronger. The logistics lead reported worsening symptoms. He refused to sleep directly on the ice, choosing instead to rest on exposed rock despite colder conditions. On the 7th day, we initiated a controlled ice core drilling operation within the revised depth limits. The objective was to sample ice layers for isotopic analysis. As the drill descended, vibration sensors began spiking. The drill motor registered resistance inconsistent with ice density at that depth. Then the temperature rose. Ambient air temperature increased several degrees despite stable weather. Frost receded from nearby equipment. A faint green light reflected upward from the borehole. I approached the opening against protocol. The light intensified in pulses, synchronized with the gravimetric readings. Looking down, I observed a crystalline structure embedded beneath the ice. It was symmetrical, faceted, internally illuminated. The pulses were slow and deliberate. The resemblance to a biological rhythm was unavoidable. The structure extended beyond the visible range of the borehole. A sound followed, low, resonant. It traveled through the ice and into my body. Cracks spread across the surface in branching patterns. The glacier began to fail inward. I ordered immediate evacuation. As we fled toward the extraction point, sections of the glacier collapsed, revealing flashes of the same green geometry beneath. The sound intensified, not ice cracking, something deeper. Our bush pilot responded to our emergency transmission and landed under unsafe conditions. We abandoned all equipment. As we lifted off, the glacier collapsed inward, sealing the opening. Within days, the area was closed. The National Park Service issued a statement citing unprecedented glacial instability. A permanent no-fly zone was established. All research permits were revoked. Federal officials interviewed us separately. All data was seized. I was instructed not to pursue further investigation. No explanation was ever given. The lingering horror is not what I saw. It is what remains beneath the ice, still pulsing, still sealed, and still officially non-existent. The Nameless Horror of Skagway. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I was 38 years old when my work took me back to Skagway, Alaska, a place I had studied for years from a distance, but never stayed in long enough to understand. I'm a historian by training, focused on the Alaskan gold rush, specifically the parts that don't make it into museums or tourist brochures. My days are usually quiet. Archives, shipping manifests, coroner ledgers. I look for patterns in ink and paper, not in the field. In early 2021, I was working on a manuscript about unexplained disappearances along the White Pass Trail. The project had stalled until an archivist in Seattle mentioned a collection of Pinkerton Detective Agency files that had never been fully cataloged. Several folders referenced Skagway. That was the trigger. I applied for a short-term research residency and relocated north. Skagway is difficult to describe accurately. On the surface, it's busy during the season. Cruise ships, souvenir shops, restored facades. But just beyond the town center, the past hasn't been rebuilt. Abandoned buildings lean into the forest. The mountains close in quickly. The White Pass Trail rises out of town and disappears into cloud cover within minutes. I arrived in late September, after most of the tourists had gone. The town felt hollowed out. Streets went quiet after dusk. People noticed strangers. Early irregularities surfaced almost immediately. Locals were friendly, but evasive when I mentioned missing prospectors. A few older residents corrected my language. They weren't missing, one man told me. They stopped coming back. Tlingit elders declined formal interviews but warned me, gently, not to stay near the trail at night. No explanations, just warnings. As I worked through the Pinkerton files, a pattern emerged. Between 1897 and 1903, dozens of prospectors vanished along sections of the White Pass considered relatively safe. These weren't novices, many were guides. Several traveled in pairs or small groups. Their gear, gold, supplies, even draft animals was often found intact. No robbery, no avalanche reports, no bodies. One detail repeated often enough to stand out. In 8 separate cases, investigators noted a crude symbol carved nearby, always similar. A twisted figure with branching lines extending from the head. It appeared on trees, rocks, even once on a bridge support. The cases were closed as lost to wilderness. I cross-referenced dates with municipal records and uncovered something else. Financial ledgers from Skagway City Hall referenced payments to a trail maintenance fund. The amounts were significant. The fund was controlled by a small group of town founders, men with political authority and business interests. There were no corresponding maintenance records, no payroll, no materials purchased. The payments spiked during periods of increased disappearances. That was my first hard evidence of a hidden crime. The second came from the Historical Society's basement. The archive was poorly cataloged, boxes stacked without labels. I was alone most nights. During one late session, while reviewing a coroner's collection from the early 1900s, I found a series of photographs that didn't match their descriptions. The images showed recovered remains, but not in ways consistent with exposure or animal predation. The bodies were intact, clothing present, features altered. Not violently damaged, just wrong. As if something had tried and failed to make them resemble someone else. The final photograph in the series was different. It was a group portrait of the Trail Maintenance Fund members. The men were smiling, posed formally. Behind them, partially obscured by shadow, stood a tall figure. Out of focus. Featureless. Present in a way I can't adequately explain. As I examined the image, the basement went silent. No building noise, no wind. I became aware of being watched, not from a direction, from everywhere. I left the basement immediately. The next morning, I reported my findings to the local sheriff. He listened, asked for copies, and told me not to circulate the photographs. He authorized a limited search of specific trail sections I identified, citing potential historical burial sites. That search uncovered a network of concealed tunnels and shelters beneath parts of the White Pass. Crude but deliberate. Inside were personal effects, boots, coats, tools, linked to multiple missing prospectors. More of the carved symbols marked the walls. The sheriff's office opened an investigation into the Trail Maintenance Fund. Records confirmed a century-old corruption scheme involving forced labor, murder, and disposal of bodies beneath the trail. Several prominent family names were implicated. The case was quietly transferred to state authorities. The tunnels were sealed. The photographs were classified as misidentified artifacts. The figure in the image was dismissed as damage to the negative. No explanation was offered for the altered remains. No charges were filed. I left Skagway weeks later. Officially, the case was closed. Unofficially, nothing felt resolved. The trail remains open. The symbols still appear, occasionally carved over and removed. The elders still avoid certain sections. The town insists the past is buried, but some things don't stay buried. And whatever watched me from that photograph is still there, waiting in the quiet places where records end and the trail disappears into fog. The mimic of Huna. For most of my career, my work had been quiet, methodical, and insulated from danger. I am a linguistic anthropologist by training, 50 years old at the time of this account, and my professional life has been defined by classrooms, archival recordings, and extended but largely uneventful field stays. I specialized in endangered indigenous dialects, particularly those shaped by long-term geographic isolation. My daily routine before Huna consisted of transcribing interviews, applying for grants, and teaching graduate seminars on phonetic drift and oral memory preservation. Fieldwork, when it occurred, followed established protocols and carried predictable risks: weather delays, cultural misunderstandings, equipment failure. Nothing in my prior experience suggested I would become a primary witness in an incident later quietly logged by authorities as a disorienting wildlife encounter. By 2019, I had begun to feel a professional urgency. Several Alaskan indigenous languages were losing fluent speakers at an accelerating rate. Oral traditions were fragmenting, altered by external influence and generational distance. When funding became available for an extended documentation project in Southeast Alaska, I accepted without hesitation. The assignment was academically routine. The location was not. The invitation came through the university's Arctic Studies Consortium, requesting a lead researcher for a 6-week documentation project in Huna, Alaska. The stated objective was to record elder narratives, ceremonial speech patterns, and vanishing idiomatic structures within the local Tailingit community. The proposal emphasized cooperation with the tribal council and noted the region's relative isolation as a benefit for linguistic preservation. What stood out to me, even then, was a brief addendum advising researchers to remain within designated areas and to coordinate all excursions with local guides. It was framed as a wildlife precaution. I did not question it. Huna is accessible primarily by boat or small aircraft. Chichagof Island is vast, forested, and sparsely populated, with temperate rainforest stretching uninterrupted for miles in every direction. The town itself is active, communal, and grounded in long-standing tradition, but beyond its edges the land closes in quickly. Roads end abruptly. Trails vanish under moss and brush. Sound behaves differently there, absorbed by trees and damp air. Once settled, I became acutely aware of the isolation. Cellular coverage was inconsistent. Satellite communications were limited. After dusk, the forest felt immediate, present, and unyielding, as though the town existed only by mutual agreement with what surrounded it. During my first week of interviews, several elders referenced a figure from Tlingit folklore known as the Gunakadayat. Historically, it appeared in stories as a boundary figure, something that punished those who strayed too far, hunted carelessly, or ignored communal warnings. It was described as capable of mimicry, of taking voices and forms that felt familiar enough to invite trust. What unsettled me was how often these references shifted from mythic past to recent experience. People spoke cautiously, lowering their voices, clarifying that these were not stories, but things that had been seen or heard. Children, when interviewed separately, described pretend parents calling them from the woods. Their descriptions were consistent across families who did not interact regularly. When I raised these points with local coordinators, I was advised gently but firmly to focus on linguistic structure, not narrative content. As my recordings accumulated, patterns emerged that exceeded coincidence. The same descriptive phrases appeared across decades of testimony. The same directional references, voices calling from uphill, from behind, from places no one should have been. I requested access to historical records and was directed to a storage room beneath the local administrative office. There, I found a leather-bound police blotter from the 1950s. It documented a series of missing persons cases: hunters, hikers, a teenager gathering firewood. In each case, the last witness statement noted the victim responding to a familiar voice heard in an unexpected location. Several entries included an identical marginal note. Unusual animal mimicry reported. The cases were never resolved. I digitized portions of the blotter and cross-referenced them with modern incident logs. Though phrasing had changed, the outcomes had not. Disappearances were now attributed to environmental exposure or navigational error. The mimicry component was absent from modern reports, replaced with neutral language. Audio recordings provided further evidence. In reviewing field recordings, I discovered faint vocalizations captured unintentionally. My own voice echoed back with slight temporal distortion, Sarah's laughter occurring when she was physically absent. The anomalies were subtle but measurable. When I brought these findings to the local police liaison assigned to our project, the response was immediate deflection. The blotter was described as anecdotal. The audio anomalies were dismissed as environmental interference. I was reminded that my role was academic, not investigative. The tribal council, while more receptive, advised caution. Certain forest areas were declared temporarily closed, officially due to unstable wildlife behavior. No further explanation was offered. The language mirrored state advisories almost exactly. The incident that ended my fieldwork occurred during a routine recording session deep in the rainforest. I was accompanied by an elder and had left my assistant, Sarah, at our base camp to monitor equipment. While recording, we heard Sarah call my name clearly, urgently, from the direction opposite the camp. I began to respond instinctively. The elder restrained me with surprising strength and told me, quietly, that the voice was not human. As the calls continued, closer now, I recognized subtle distortions, timing irregularities, tonal flatness inconsistent with emotional urgency. The forest fell silent. No birds, no wind. A figure emerged near the camp. It appeared identical to Sarah in posture, clothing, and movement. It called out again, its voice emotionally precise but fundamentally empty. Through my recorder, the waveform later showed unnatural consistency, lacking microvariations typical of human speech. The elder documented the encounter in writing immediately after. Her account matched historical descriptions almost word for word. When the figure realized we would not respond, its expression changed briefly. The face lost cohesion, features elongating unnaturally before it retreated into the forest, with speed inconsistent with human physiology. There was no pursuit, no sound. Moments later, the real Sarah returned, visibly shaken. She had heard voices calling her as well. We evacuated the site under tribal escort. Within days, several forest trails were formally closed. State wildlife officials issued warnings. Our recordings were requested by authorities and partially withheld under advisory review. No formal investigation was announced. The incident was categorized as psychological stress combined with environmental factors. Access to historical records was restricted. My final report was edited to remove speculative components before publication. The Kodiak remains categorized as folklore. The forest remains open beyond designated closures. Disappearances continue, logged under different language. I no longer conduct solo fieldwork. What unsettles me most is not what I saw, but how seamlessly the system absorbed it, how easily centuries of consistent testimony were reduced to noise. Voices still call from the forest. Some are answered. The Shadow Mines of Juneau. My name is Clara Hansen. I am 35, and I have spent the better part of a decade chasing corporate malfeasance, environmental cover-ups, and the hidden consequences of human greed. Over the years, I have learned to read between the lines of sanitized press releases, corporate assurances, and government statements. I have learned that the truth almost never lies where it is easiest to find. When the lead brought me to Juneau, Alaska, I was prepared for the usual mix of remoteness and opacity. Juneau is a city built into the mountains, hemmed in by glaciers and dense forest, where roads often end in sheer cliffs or frozen fjords. The population is small, measured in tens of thousands, yet its history is colossal. A city born of gold rush ambitions, whose wealth once poured out of the earth with relentless extraction. I had arrived not as a tourist, but as an investigator. My focus was the abandoned Treadwell Mine Complex on Douglas Island, just across Gastineau Channel. At its peak, Treadwell was one of the largest gold mining operations in the world, a sprawling network of shafts, tunnels, and machinery. Today, the complex was a ruin, slowly reclaimed by the elements: collapsed buildings, rusting equipment, flooded shafts. To most locals, it was a relic, but the rumors I had followed painted a different picture. The site may have been home to far more than forgotten ore. In the weeks leading up to the assignment, I had maintained my standard investigative routine. My mornings began with reviewing leads, calls with sources, and poring over environmental reports. I documented each phone conversation, noting inconsistencies and hesitations. My evenings were spent combing through digital archives, court records, and regulatory filings. By the time I left for Juneau, I had a clear plan: identify potential risks, establish contacts, and triangulate any irregular activity. In my life, quiet days were rare but necessary. They allowed me to maintain focus, to notice anomalies that others might overlook. I kept my camera equipment organized, my notebooks updated, and my digital backups redundant. Little did I know how critical each habit would become when confronted with what lay beneath Treadwell Mine. The assignment itself began with a tip. An anonymous source claimed the mine was being used for illegal disposal of industrial waste, far beyond what had been publicly acknowledged. The person, speaking in hushed tones over an untraceable line, hinted at environmental violations that had been deliberately suppressed, with local officials complicit in covering them up. I also received fragments of internal company memos from the 1990s, describing consultant payments and special projects that never appeared in public filings. The implication was unmistakable. Someone had deliberately repurposed the abandoned mine for disposal of hazardous materials. I knew enough to treat the tip cautiously. Unverified leads can be traps, and in Alaska's small communities, rumor and reality can blur quickly. But the specifics, the dates, the sums of money, the technical terminology, spoke to someone with intimate knowledge. I had to investigate. Douglas Island is only a short ferry ride from downtown Juneau, yet the mine entrances feel a world away. Dense forest gives way to overgrown roads that twist and fall to sudden cliffs overlooking the channel. The mine itself was tucked behind the remnants of the old worker housing and rusted machinery. The silence was oppressive. No birdsong, no wind through the trees, only the occasional drip of water from collapsed roof beams. The isolation was total. I met Elias Vance, a former Treadwell engineer, at a staging area near the western entrance. Elias had spent his career underground, and his knowledge of the old tunnels was invaluable. He had agreed to accompany me after hearing that I intended to document everything and submit evidence to federal authorities immediately should we find anything substantial. From the moment we approached the site, subtle warning signs began to emerge. Graffiti marked old equipment sheds with cryptic symbols, some resembling tally marks, others undecipherable. Locals we spoke to were reluctant to discuss the mine. One retired miner simply shook his head and muttered, "Don't go poking where you don't belong." A fisherman along Gastineau Channel mentioned strange lights emanating from sealed entrances late at night and a recurring chemical smell. At first, it seemed anecdotal, a combination of superstition and misremembered industrial smells. But as we explored, these stories became harder to dismiss. Reviewing the internal memos and government reports, a pattern began to emerge. Certain names appeared repeatedly. Consultants paid unusually high fees, city officials signing off on projects with little oversight, environmental inspectors who suddenly retired or transferred out of state. Repeated references to vent shaft stabilization and material containment in company correspondence suggested that some of the older mine shafts may have been repurposed. Dates in the late 1980s and early 1990s coincided with reports of unexplained accidents among late-era Treadwell employees, workers who vanished from the site or fell ill after visiting specific tunnels. Our first tangible proof came unexpectedly. Elias had access to old blueprints, which he cross-referenced with satellite imagery and the internal documents I had obtained. We found that several shafts listed as collapsed or sealed were accessible, though dangerous. Entering a small ventilation tunnel, we discovered remnants of barrels, corroded and leaking a thick, iridescent substance. We documented everything meticulously: photographs, video footage, GPS coordinates, and written logs. Each barrel was tagged with faded labels referencing chemical compounds known to be highly toxic. My stomach turned when I realized these barrels had been hidden for decades, invisible to federal oversight, their presence denied in every publicly released report. As soon as preliminary findings were shared with regulatory authorities, resistance appeared. The local EPA office delayed meetings, citing procedural backlogs. City officials denied knowledge of any barrels, even when presented with the internal memos. Requests for additional documentation were met with obfuscation. Some reports were missing or archived, inaccessible under standard Freedom of Information procedures. It became clear that any attempt to bring this to light would face both bureaucratic inertia and deliberate obstruction. One evening, while reviewing footage in my hotel room, I noticed a black SUV parked across the street, idling for hours. Footsteps echoed in the hallways of the adjacent building. Doors that should have been locked were ajar. Elias received an anonymous call warning us to stop digging. The tension escalated. On subsequent days, as we reconnoitered the site, shadows moved in the corners of the tunnels, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed in areas we had traversed only moments before. We realized that someone, or several people, were monitoring our activity. After several days of reconnaissance, we located the main hidden chamber. A lesser-known access tunnel, overgrown and partially collapsed, led to a massive cavern. Thousands of barrels filled the space, some corroded and leaking into a dark, viscous pool. The liquid glowed with a sickly green luminescence under our flashlight beams. It had seeped into the mine floor, forming shallow streams that reflected the skeletal remains of beams and machinery. We recorded everything, careful to remain on safe ground, though the air itself was toxic, metallic, chemical, and suffocating. The scale of the operation was far beyond any environmental violation I had previously encountered. While documenting the scene, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind us. A team of men in dark uniforms appeared, clearly armed and organized, their demeanor unyielding. "You shouldn't be here," one said, his voice low but firm, hand resting on a holstered weapon. It was evident they were tasked with protecting this secret at any cost. Elias and I had no choice but to use the old mine's maze-like layout. A prearranged diversion, a small demolition of a ventilation shaft, created a cascade of dust and noise, temporarily obscuring us. We ran through narrow tunnels, over treacherous debris, narrowly avoiding collapse, until we reached an emergency exit we had identified on the blueprints. Once outside, gasping for clean air, we contacted federal authorities immediately. Our video, photographs, and documentation were submitted as evidence. Within weeks, the FBI and EPA conducted a full-scale investigation. The mine and surrounding land were sealed, and forensic analysis confirmed the presence of industrial toxins far exceeding legal limits. The public release triggered outrage. Corporate executives were arrested, as were local officials who had accepted kickbacks. Cleanup efforts were extensive, though they continue to this day, as the scale of environmental contamination was far larger than initially anticipated. The scandal rocked Juneau. Lawsuits, federal oversight, and congressional inquiries followed. Several former employees who had previously feared speaking out came forward, corroborating our findings. Yet even with arrests and remediation, the incident left a lingering mark. The local watershed still shows elevated levels of carcinogens, and the mine itself, though sealed, remains a monument to the greed and negligence that allowed such a disaster to fester in silence. Even months later, I cannot forget the green luminescent pools, the oppressive silence of the tunnels, or the sense that the mine itself was watching. While federal action mitigated immediate danger, the site's long-term ecological impact remains uncertain. Every report of elevated toxins, every new, unexplained illness in Douglas Island residents serves as a reminder that some shadows never truly lift. The Treadwell mine is no longer just a historical ruin. It is a cautionary tale of corporate malfeasance, institutional complicity, and the enduring consequences of secrecy. In Juneau, the mountains remain serene, the water glints under the sun, and the forests whisper in the wind. Yet beneath that calm, deep in the abandoned tunnels of Treadwell, the legacy of human greed remains, hidden but palpable, a reminder that some truths are buried only temporarily, waiting for the right or wrong eyes to uncover them. The Bone Collector of Nome. I had already spent more than 2 decades working as a state trooper by the time I was reassigned to Nome. I was 48, close enough to retirement that most of my peers were angling for administrative posts or training roles. I did not. I had built my career in places most officers avoided: isolated detachments, seasonal villages, temporary outposts where the weather killed more people than violence ever did. I trusted routine because routine was what kept you alive when backup was measured in hours instead of minutes. I trusted paper trails, incident reports, and evidence lockers. If something couldn't be documented, it didn't exist as far as I was concerned. Nome felt like the end of that philosophy. The town sits where the road system gives up entirely. Beyond it, there is only tundra, ice, and water that freezes solid enough to blur the line between land and sea. When I arrived in late October, winter was already tightening its grip. The Iditarod banners were still up from the previous spring, faded and snapping in the wind, reminders of a time when people actually came here on purpose. Most days the streets were empty, businesses closed early, conversations stayed shallow. People learned not to ask questions because questions had a way of lingering. My daily routine was simple. Morning briefings at the detachment, checking weather reports, reviewing incident logs. Afternoons were spent closing out minor cases, snow machine accidents, intoxication calls, welfare checks that rarely ended well. Evenings, I walked. The cold helped me think. The horizon never changed. Just variations of gray and white layered on top of each other. Isolation like that compresses your thoughts. There's nowhere for them to escape. 2 weeks after my arrival, I was assigned a file review that had been sitting untouched for years. No urgency, no directive. Just a quiet transfer from the regional office with a note attached. See if there's anything here we missed. The files concerned missing persons. At first glance, they looked ordinary. In Alaska, people vanish all the time. Hunters misjudge weather. Tourists overestimate themselves. Prospectors wander too far without radios. Most are never found. The wilderness does not return evidence. That reality had closed more cases than any detective ever could. But these were different. There were 13 files spanning just over a decade. Each disappearance occurred between late November and early March. 1 per year, sometimes 2, never more. The victims had no consistent profile. Men and women, locals and outsiders, young adults, middle-aged workers, 1 retired miner. Each case had been handled by different officers, different administrations. Each had been quietly closed. What caught my attention was not what was missing, but what was left behind. In 9 of the cases, an item had been recovered near the last known location days or weeks after the disappearance. The reports barely acknowledged them. Unrelated artifact, one read. Possibly decorative, another said. Each description referenced a small carved object made from bone, roughly shaped like a human figure. No names attached, no follow-up. I requested access to the evidence locker. Seeing the objects in person changed the texture of the investigation. They were not crude. Whoever made them had skill, patience, and time. The bone had been cleaned thoroughly, polished smooth by hand. Each figure was roughly palm-sized. Arms, legs, torsos all present but abstracted. Faces were suggested rather than detailed. No 2 were identical. What disturbed me most was the consistency of intent. These weren't souvenirs. They weren't art in the conventional sense, they were markers. I logged measurements, photographed them again, requested forensic analysis that had never been done. The response was delayed. When it finally came, it was inconclusive by design. Animal bone, the report stated. Species undetermined, no evidentiary value. I asked around. The local deputies avoided eye contact when I brought it up. One suggested the carvings were old, possibly indigenous artifacts. Another said tourists leave strange things behind all the time. The sheriff at the time listened politely and then redirected the conversation to staffing shortages and budget concerns. When I spoke with Inupiaq elders, the tone shifted entirely. They didn't dismiss the objects, they didn't exaggerate them either. They spoke cautiously, with long pauses between sentences. One elder used a word I had trouble translating fully, tunrak. He explained it wasn't a monster or spirit in the way outsiders imagined. It was a role. Something that existed when balance was disturbed. Something that collected what was owed. I asked directly if it took people. He didn't answer that question. Instead, he asked me who was paying, and that question stayed with me longer than any folklore. It reframed the entire pattern. I went back to the files and began constructing a timeline, not of disappearances but of responses, search budgets, emergency funding, overtime hours logged during winter months. What I found didn't align with the official narrative of understaffing and limited resources. Every winter that coincided with a disappearance showed a spike in discretionary spending. Funds moved quickly through accounts tied to infrastructure projects that never materialized. Consulting fees paid to shell companies with no employees. Community outreach programs that existed only on paper. When traced further, the money looped back, offshore briefly, then returned to personal accounts belonging to a small group of town officials and influential business owners. The timing was precise. I submitted a formal report outlining the financial anomalies and requested authority to expand the investigation. The response came back neutral and slow. Additional documentation was required. Jurisdictional questions were raised. My access to certain records was restricted pending review. That was when I understood this wasn't negligence, it was containment. The resistance was subtle. Nobody threatened me. Nobody raised their voice. Requests were misplaced. Emails went unanswered. Meetings were postponed indefinitely. A supervisor from Anchorage suggested I was overinvested in historical cases and advised me to focus on current duties. Then a new person vanished. He was a German backpacker, early 20s, staying at a seasonal hostel that catered to off-season travelers chasing isolation. He had arrived alone, kept to himself, spent days asking locals about winter trails and abandoned mining sites. His disappearance followed the pattern exactly, mid-February, during a period of worsening weather. Officially, search efforts were delayed due to an incoming blizzard. Unofficially, nobody seemed surprised. I reviewed his movements. Credit card receipts. A single cell phone ping near the edge of town, close to an abandoned gold dredge that hadn't been used in decades. The area was remote but accessible by snow machine. Dangerous but not impossible. I went alone. The storm arrived faster than forecasted. Snow reduced visibility to a few feet. Wind howled across the open tundra, erasing tracks almost as quickly as they were made. The dredge loomed out of the white like a carcass, metal ribs exposed, partially buried by drifts. Inside, the silence was immediate and oppressive. The structure absorbed sound. My flashlight cut through darkness thick with dust and frost. That was when I smelled it. Not decay, but something cleaner. Bone stripped of everything else. The interior had been converted into a workspace. Bones lined the walls, sorted by size and type. Femurs stacked together. Skulls arranged carefully. Some partially carved. Tools lay neatly on a table. Knives, files, and chisels worn smooth from use. Several finished figures sat in a row, identical in form to those in evidence. He was there. Silas Blackwood, late 60s, former prospector who had stayed behind when others left. His name appeared briefly in older files as a witness, a man who knew the land. He wore layered clothing stained dark with age and use. His face was partially obscured by a mask fashioned from bone fragments bound together with wire and dried sinew. He didn't run. He spoke calmly, not to me, but to the bones. He said they didn't understand what he was doing, and that the town had learned long ago what happened when nothing was given, that he was helping keep the balance. When I asked about the missing backpacker, he gestured to a workbench where a fresh femur lay, partially carved. The confrontation was sudden and violent. The space was too tight for distance. He moved with desperation rather than strength. I survived because training takes over when thought fails. Because he was old, because luck still existed that night. Backup arrived hours later after the storm eased. Blackwood was taken into custody. The dredge was sealed. The aftermath moved faster than anything I had seen in my career. Federal agents arrived quietly within days. Financial records were seized. Officials resigned, citing health reasons. No public statements were made. Blackwood was declared criminally incompetent, transferred to a secure facility, and died before trial. The official explanation was clean. A lone serial offender enabled by corruption. Case closed. But not everything closed. The dredge remains sealed, not dismantled. The financial anomalies have diminished, but not disappeared. Each winter, small irregularities surface in budgets again. No new disappearances have been officially recorded, but reports of missing travelers are quietly redirected to neighboring jurisdictions. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind carries sound across the tundra just right, it feels like Nome is still waiting, as if something was interrupted, not ended. I still believe in evidence. I still believe in procedure. But I have learned that documentation can be shaped and silence can be purchased. And in places like Nome, where the land remembers longer than people do, some balances are never fully restored. The Chronos Glitch of Valdez. My name is Jeremy Finch. I was 30 years old when this happened, and until then my life had been defined by routine, documentation, and a quiet confidence in systems that could be measured and verified. I worked as a freelance wilderness photographer based in Anchorage, contracted mostly by environmental nonprofits, academic institutions, and land management agencies. My job was to record change slowly, glacial retreat measured over decades, animal migration patterns traced by repetition, erosion documented frame by frame. I trusted time because time behaved consistently. It moved forward, it left evidence. Before Valdez, nothing had seriously challenged that assumption. Most of my weeks followed the same structure. I would receive an assignment, review topographic maps and satellite data, plan routes, and spend days alone in the field. I carried redundancies for everything: GPS units, film and digital cameras, handwritten logs. Isolation never bothered me. In fact, I preferred it. The wilderness made sense to me because it followed rules, even harsh ones. Weather systems obeyed physics. Light behaved predictably. When something went wrong, there was always a cause that could be traced. The Valdez assignment came in the late summer. A regional environmental nonprofit wanted updated imagery of Prince William Sound and the surrounding inland corridors. Climate data from the area had shown irregular melt patterns, and they needed high-resolution visual documentation to support a grant application. Valdez was the natural staging point. It sat at the head of the Sound, enclosed by steep mountains and glaciers, accessible by a single road and water. I had passed through once before, years earlier, but had never worked there in depth. Nothing about the job felt unusual. 10 days, mostly solo, a mix of coastal and inland shots. I booked a modest motel, checked weather forecasts, and loaded my gear. Valdez greeted me with clear skies and an unsettling stillness. The town itself was small, orderly, and visually dramatic. Towering peaks rising almost immediately from the water, waterfalls cutting through rock faces, mist clinging to higher elevations. It felt contained, almost sealed off. There was only one way in and out by road, and the ocean closed off the other directions. I noted that sense of enclosure without assigning meaning to it. The first day passed without incident. I scouted coastal locations, took test shots, and logged light conditions. People were polite but reserved. Conversations stayed shallow. When I mentioned my plans to hike sections of the old Valdez Trail, responses became brief. No one told me not to go. they just stopped offering details. That evening, at a small diner near the harbor, the first comment broke through the surface. An older man at the counter overheard me talking about photographing waterfalls inland. Without turning fully around, he said, "If you see the shimmers, don't follow them." I asked him what he meant. He stared into his coffee for a moment, then stood, paid his bill and left. No explanation. Later, back at the motel, I asked the clerk about it. She smiled in a way that felt practiced and said the light does strange things here. Mountains, water, ice, they bend things. Optical illusions. She suggested polarized filters and laughed softly, but she avoided eye contact. I accepted the explanation. Alaska is full of localized phenomena that sound mystical until you understand the mechanics. Temperature inversions, atmospheric refraction, mirages. I had photographed all of them before. Over the next few days, I moved inland. I followed maintained trails first, then older routes marked on historical maps but barely used anymore. The further I went, the quieter it became. Wildlife activity dropped off abruptly in certain stretches. Not gradually, but all at once, like crossing an invisible boundary. Birds stopped calling. Insects disappeared. Wind died down. At first, I appreciated the calm. It made for clean audio notes and steady shots. But when I reviewed my images at night, small inconsistencies started to appear. Photos taken minutes apart showed shadows cast at angles that didn't align with the sun's documented position. In one sequence, a ridgeline appeared, subtly altered between frames. Nothing dramatic, but enough that I checked for lens distortion or sensor error. My GPS logs raised similar questions. Routes I knew I had walked straight showed brief, sharp deviations, jumps of several meters sideways then back again. I flagged them as signal interference caused by terrain. Narrow valleys can do that. I wrote it down and moved on. The next irregularity was linguistic. While researching at the Valdez Museum on a rest day, I reviewed archival maps and settlement records related to the gold rush era. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just historical context to pair with landscape shots. That's when I noticed repeated references to missing individuals along the inland routes. Disappearance reports weren't unusual for that period. Harsh conditions claimed a lot of people. What stood out were the repetitions. Certain names appeared more than once, sometimes decades apart, attached to phrases like reported again or believed seen. One name in particular, Harlan Pike, appeared in an 1899 missing persons ledger, then again in a 1937 oral history transcript attributed to a local elder. The transcript described Pike as never found, but sometimes seen on the trail. I asked the archivist about it. She closed the folder and told me oral histories were unreliable. When I pressed, pointing out the official ledger entry, she said some stories were better left unexamined. Her exact words were, "This town has had enough eyes on it." That response unsettled me more than the documents themselves. The first tangible piece of evidence came 2 days later, during a rainstorm. I had been hiking an overgrown section of trail when the weather turned quickly. I took shelter in an abandoned cabin set back from the main route. It was barely standing, likely dating back to early 20th century trapping operations. While photographing the interior for reference, I noticed a loose plank in the wall. Behind it was a small cavity, and inside that cavity was a journal wrapped in oilcloth. The journal belonged to a prospector. The entries spanned several months in the late 1800s. The tone was methodical at first. Weather notes, supply counts, distances traveled. Then it shifted. He described animals vanishing mid-movement. A moose leaving tracks that simply stopped. A dog team returning without dogs, harnesses dragging empty. He wrote about men stepping into wrong air and not coming back. Several pages were devoted to sketches. They depicted elongated distortions in the landscape, like vertical ripples. The prospector referred to them as rips and warned against touching them. One margin note read, "Time, don't stay put here." I photographed every page and resealed the journal. Back in town, I started connecting points. The coordinates mentioned in the journal roughly aligned with the GPS anomalies I had logged. They also overlapped with areas referenced in some of the historical disappearance records. Out of habit more than expectation, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request for unclassified FAA incident reports related to instrument failures near Valdez between 1970 and 1985. I assumed I would receive nothing. Instead, weeks later, I received a partial release. The reports described temporary loss of altitude readings, compass spin, and radio silence over specific inland coordinates. Several pilots independently noted visual anomalies, terrain that didn't match charts, forests where glaciers should be, rivers flowing the wrong direction. One report used the phrase, "brief impossible view." I took the documents to the local FAO liaison office. The man there skimmed them and told me those incidents had been reviewed decades ago. When I asked what conclusions were reached, he said, "weather balloons and solar interference." When I pointed out the repeated coordinates and their proximity to the old trail, he stopped answering questions. He told me to leave the documents with him and suggested I focus on my photography. I did not leave the documents. From that point on, I noticed changes in how people interacted with me. Conversations ended when I approached. A ranger I had spoken with earlier about trail conditions suddenly claimed not to remember me. My motel room showed signs of entry when I returned one afternoon. Nothing stolen, just disturbed. The escalation came during a solo hike toward a waterfall I had marked early in my planning. The trail was barely visible. The air grew unnaturally still. The forest went silent. Light began to behave strangely, not flickering but stretching, as if dawn and dusk were compressed into seconds. Ahead of me, the air distorted. It wasn't heat haze, it had structure, depth. A translucent curtain hung between trees. I stood there longer than I should have. Curiosity overrode caution. I reached out. My hand passed through the distortion. On the other side was a different landscape. Dense, untouched forest, species I didn't recognize grazing calmly. When I pulled my hand back, pain flared. A perfect circular burn glowed faint blue on my wrist. Then someone stepped out of it. He wore 19th century prospecting gear. His face was gaunt, eyes wide with terror. He stared at me as if I were impossible. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came. The distortion collapsed, and he vanished. I ran. I don't remember the entire return trip. I know I fell. I know I lost time. When I reached the outskirts of town, my GPS log showed a gap of nearly 40 minutes I couldn't account for. The hospital documented the burn. The physician suggested a chemical reaction or electrical discharge. When I described what I saw, she stopped taking notes. A state trooper interviewed me later and concluded I was suffering from stress-induced hallucinations. My photographs were logged and returned to me, missing several frames I know I took. Weeks after I left Valdez, I was contacted by a federal investigator. He confirmed that the FAA reports were part of a larger anomaly file. He also told me, off record, that the coordinates I identified were now restricted airspace. No public explanation was given. No press release, no closure. The old Valdez Trail remains officially open, but new signage quietly redirects hikers away from certain sections. Satellite imagery over those areas updates less frequently than surrounding land. I still have the journal, I still have most of the files, and I still have the scar. Valdez still shimmers, according to those who live there. Sometimes briefly, sometimes long enough for someone to notice. Whatever is happening in those valleys was never resolved. It was documented, contained, and left alone. And that, more than anything I saw, is what still keeps me awake. The asylum's echoes of Sitka. I am a forensic psychiatrist by training, but my work for the past decade has been largely archival. I specialize in historical cases of institutional abuse, closed hospitals, shuttered reformatories, facilities that no longer exist on maps but still appear in federal footnotes and litigation addenda. I don't chase rumors. I analyze patterns left behind in paperwork, intake forms, disciplinary logs, medication inventories, mortality discrepancies. My daily routine reflected that mindset. I worked alone. I lived alone. My apartment was quiet, my schedule rigid. Mornings were spent reviewing scanned documents. Afternoons were reserved for writing or consultation. I avoided fieldwork unless the record was unusually incomplete or internally contradictory. I had no intention of traveling to Alaska. St. Elias Asylum entered my life as a citation, one line in a 1962 territorial health audit that referenced unresolved patient disposition irregularities at a Sitka-based psychiatric facility officially closed 8 years earlier. There was no elaboration, no corrective action, no follow-up report. In my field, silence like that is never accidental. I submitted a routine records request through the National Archives for the audit's supporting materials. 2 weeks later, I received a phone call from Anchorage. The caller introduced himself as a junior archivist, his voice careful in the way people speak when they don't want to be overheard. He told me that several transfer logs connected to St. Elias had been misfiled under a defunct territorial agency, and asked whether I still wanted copies. When I said yes, he paused. He then said, "If you want them, I recommend acting quickly. They're scheduled for reclassification under medical privacy exemptions." I asked why records from a closed institution, involving patients who would now be deceased, required reclassification. He didn't answer that question. Instead, he said, "I'm not supposed to be calling you directly." The line went dead. I booked my flight to Sitka within the hour. Sitka does not feel like most Alaskan towns. It is coastal, temperate, almost deceptively gentle. Rain replaces snow. The forest presses close, but the town itself feels preserved, curated. Russian architecture stands beside modern municipal buildings. Tourists come for history and scenery, but isolation is built into the geography. There are no roads connecting Sitka to the mainland. Once you arrive, you are contained by water and forest. Distance behaves differently there. The sound of boats carries farther than expected. Silence settles quickly. St. Elias Asylum sat just outside the town boundary, perched on a bluff overlooking the Tongass Narrows. Even abandoned, it was impossible to ignore. The structure was massive. 4 stories of reinforced concrete and brick, constructed to endure weather and time. The western wing had partially collapsed, but the central structure remained intact. From the harbor, locals still referenced it casually. The old hospital, they called it. No warning signs marked the property, no fencing, no official designation. It felt less abandoned than neglected. The first irregularities appeared immediately, but not where I expected. When I mentioned St. Elias in conversation, people became guarded. At a cafe near the harbor, a man stopped speaking mid-sentence when I asked whether anyone still had family who worked there. Another patron warned me the building was unstable and advised me to stay away, then quickly changed the subject. At City Hall, I requested municipal documents related to the asylum's closure: permits, safety inspections, transfer agreements. The clerk told me those records had been transferred to state custody decades earlier. Later that day, the state health office told me the city retained them. No one refused my requests outright. They delayed, redirected, suggested alternative research topics. One official recommended I focus on Sitka's Russian colonial history instead, saying it would be less complicated. That word, complicated, was doing a lot of work. By the end of my first week, I had assembled a partial record from disparate sources. Patient intake logs from the 1930s and 1940s showed an unusually high number of long-term residents labeled non-responsive or unimprovable. Many had no recorded diagnoses beyond behavioral descriptors. Transfer orders were frequent, but corresponding arrival records at other facilities were absent. Names repeated. Not exact matches, slight spelling changes, middle initials added or removed, but the patterns were consistent. Individuals appeared to be re-entered into the system under altered identities. The staff rosters raised more serious concerns. Superintendent Harold Klein appeared continuously from 1938 until the asylum's closure in 1954. That alone was unusual, given multiple territorial oversight changes during that period. His signature appeared on intake approvals, transfer authorizations, disciplinary actions, and final disposition forms. Yet there was no record of Klein ever being audited, investigated, or disciplined. In the context of institutional abuse, longevity without scrutiny is rarely benign. The first piece of hard evidence came from an unexpected place. A volunteer at the Sitka Historical Society agreed to let me review non-exhibit medical materials stored in the building's basement. The boxes were unmarked beyond a handwritten label: medical, non-display. Inside were ledgers that did not appear in any official inventory. One ledger documented what were termed behavioral trials. The language was clinical, restrained, and deliberately vague. Treatments were described without specifying methods. Outcomes were frequently listed as unresolved. What troubled me most were the dates. The entries extended to 1956. St. Elias Asylum officially closed in 1954. Several entries referenced audio recordings stored on site for review. There was no indication those recordings had ever been destroyed. When I submitted a formal request to access the asylum property, the city's legal office denied it, citing liability concerns. A state health official told me the site had been cleared of materials and posed no investigative value. That statement directly contradicted the ledger. My follow-up emails went unanswered. Phone calls were returned days later, often by different officials who claimed unfamiliarity with my case. One suggested that my inquiry could reopen old wounds in the community. Another asked whether my university endorsed the project. The implication was clear. This was no longer just historical research. I visited St. Elias without authorization. I approached from the shoreline, following a narrow path through the trees. The building loomed larger as I drew closer. Up close, the decay was less advanced than expected. Many doors were still intact. Several windows had been boarded from the inside, not the outside. When I crossed the threshold, the silence was immediate. It was not the absence of sound. It was the sense that sound had been removed. Even my own footsteps felt muted. In the west wing, I found a reinforced steel door still locked from the outside. Beyond it, a corridor lined with observation windows faced inward, toward rooms I could not access. I became aware of the sensation of being watched. There was no movement, no sound. Just the persistent awareness that the space was not as empty as it should have been. When I returned to my car, I noticed fresh tire tracks nearby. They had not been there when I arrived. That night, my hotel room phone rang once at 2:13 a.m. No one spoke. 2 days later, I received an email from an anonymous sender. It contained only directions and a time. I followed them. The sender turned out to be a former maintenance worker who had been employed at St. Elias during its final years. He refused to give his name. He told me he had been instructed never to enter certain areas alone and never to ask questions about after-hours activity. He directed me to a collapsed service tunnel beneath the east wing. Inside the crawl space, sealed in oilskin, were reel-to-reel tapes labeled with patient numbers that matched the ledger entries. Many were degraded. One was intact enough to play. The recording was a clinical interview. The tone was calm. The questions were methodical. Over time, the patient's responses deteriorated into confusion and distress. The interviewer's voice remained steady. I recognized it from the documents. Superintendent Klein. 2 days after I copied the tapes, a man approached me outside my hotel. He identified himself as a state risk assessor. He knew my name, my room number, and the scope of my research. He suggested I turn over the materials for proper handling. When I refused, he informed me that possession of unauthorized medical recordings could constitute a felony. His tone was neutral, informational. That night, my laptop was accessed remotely. Files were deleted. My notes were partially corrupted. The tapes remained untouched. I contacted a federal civil rights attorney I had worked with previously. Within 48 hours, the FBI opened a preliminary inquiry into unlawful detention and post-closure experimentation. Agents arrived quietly. The asylum was sealed. Records were seized. The man who confronted me was reassigned. No charges were filed against him. The investigation confirmed that experimental procedures continued at St. Elias after its official closure, funded through misallocated territorial health grants. Several officials were posthumously implicated. One surviving administrator resigned without comment. No one was prosecuted. The asylum was scheduled for demolition. Then the schedule was withdrawn. St. Elias still stands. The tapes are evidence now, locked away. Several patient outcomes remain officially unresolved. When I review the recordings, there is a recurring moment, just before each session ends, where all background sound drops out. No movement, no breathing, just silence. According to the most recent structural survey, part of the east wing remains sealed. No explanation given. The building overlooks the water still, and at night its windows remain dark.